I hope is here. He is here. Kim Hobbs is a kind of a favorite of the 451st Bomb Group. He first came to our reunion in Tempe, Arizona, and then he also came to our reunion in Oklahoma City, and now is here at our third reunion. And while I should mention, and I have to do this in kind of defense of our own bomb group, the 351st and the 451st and the 376 bomb groups, I think were the only bomb groups in the 15th Air Force to be awarded 3 presidential unit citations. So the 376 is a veteran group, and Kim is a son of a pilot, a seasoned pilot from the 376, deceased. His name is Charles L. Hobbs. And Kim is going to pick up on the idea of the problem with navigation in World War II. This is about the famous plane, the Lady Be Good. You probably have all read about her several times. And Kim, where are you? Come forward, right here.
Well, I want to thank Gwen Jones for inviting me. I would thank him a lot more. I was supposed to follow behind a navigator, which kind of would give you a point of reference. You didn't tell me I was going to have to follow behind Jimmy the Greek. Hey, Rocky, watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat.
Tough act to follow.
Tough act to follow. Okay. Well, I thank y'all for coming, and thank you for listening. As Wynn said, I did this 3 years ago in Tempe, Arizona, but I'll try and keep you awake. Like I said, if I had a navigator ahead of me, well, then you got a reference of the proper way to do things. My father was Charles L. Hobbs. He was the first pilot, and he was arrived in Seluk, at the base at Seluk, Libya, in early April 1943. When referenced, the 376 Bomb Group has a long history of accomplishments and firsts. And it was the first Army Air Corps group to be based on the African continent in June 4th, 1942. It was the first group to bomb the European continent, Ploiești, Romania, in June 12th, 1942. It was the first heavy bomb group to be based on European soil in Italy. It was the only group to be activated in overseas in combat. And its last mission was flown April the 15th, 1945, for a total of 451 combat missions, during which it earned 3 distinguished unit citations, shot down 220 enemy aircraft, had 1,479 casualties, at a loss of 169 planes. But as I attend these bomb group reunions and introduce myself as a representative of 376, most comments I get to hear run something along the lines of, oh yeah, that was a group that led that low-level mission to Ploiești in 43 and made the wrong turn. And that was a group that was supposedly on that milk run to Vicenza, Italy after Christmas, lost a whole squadron. And that was a group that had that plane that they found out there in the middle of the desert, the Lady Be Good. Well, all those statements are true. Does anybody remember the sister ship to the Titanic? It was called the Olympia. It was launched October 20th, 1910, and it had a long career and sailed until September 19th, 1937. It had an affectionate following and earned the nickname Old Reliable. Success and fame can be fleeting and are soon forgotten, but some errors in judgment and tragedies are so great that we can't let them go and remember them to this day. And I have been asked to speak about one, the Lady Be Good, today. And if I don't mess this up, maybe you'll invite me back and I'll tell you about them other two. For those who don't already know the story, or are kind enough to sit and listen, here are some of the facts. You can download this information on YouTube. I'll make mention of these things. The Armstrong Theater put out a program in 1960, and you can buy that or download that on YouTube. And the History Channel has a program on great air mysteries about the Lady Be Good. And I don't think you can buy it, but I think you can watch it on YouTube. The Lady Be Good was an early model B-24D manufactured by the Consolidated Aircraft Company in its plant in San Diego. It took off at 3 p.m. April 4th, 1943 on a mission to bomb Naples, Italy from a base in Saluk, Libya. Both the plane and the crew were brand new, just having arrived from training in the United States, but neither one of them had any combat experience. Neither crew nor plane returned to the base that night, and their whereabouts remained unknown until 16 years later when the plane was found. Now, sorry, I don't do this thing for a living, so now I let my wife do all the eBay and the Facebook, so I don't have a PowerPoint or slideshow. I'm computer illiterate. But I do have 2 books on the table in the hospitality room, and you're welcome to peruse through those, and they have more pictures and more information for you to read and enjoy. The facts about the crew on this particular flight, the only thing unusual about them was their age. They were far older than most crews. The first pilot, William J. Hatton, was deemed to be an old man when he took pilot training at the age of 25 in 1942. He originally trained as a fighter pilot, and though he did not earn glowing marks or high grades, he thought that being transferred to a bomber pilot was a demotion because of his lack of being a shining star. Well, I don't feel that way because I've talked to other pilots who finished their training and could tell you how well a P-47 handled and how much they love to fly it. But he told me when they sent me out to Davis-Monthan and I walked out there on the field, all I saw was a line of B-24s, and I asked, "Where's my plane?" And they told me, "That's it, son, you're a bomber pilot." So they sent you where you were needed, not always where you wanted to go. So Hatton was known as a decent man with an open heart, and he wrote letters to his mother, and he had just gotten married before going overseas. He was born in Jersey City, New Jersey. The second Yankee flying was his co-pilot, Robert F. Toner. He was a year older than Hatton, born in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, and he was the more experienced of the two. Having gone to Canada, he was an experienced pilot in the Canadian Air Force with over 200 hours. And he returned to the United States, enlisted, and had to qualify all over again. The navigator, D.P. Hayes, no initial, that's a family name, D.P., was from Lee Summit, Missouri, and he was a former bank clerk, and at the age of 23, he was already losing his hair and turning gray. So he looked older than he was. The other older man on the crew was 26-year-old John S. Waravaca of Cleveland, Ohio. He was the bombardier. Harold J. Ripslinger was a flight engineer. He was 22 from Saginaw, Michigan. Robert E. LaMotta was a radio operator from Lake Linden, Michigan, and he was 22. Guy E. Shelby was a gunner from Bel Air, Ohio. He was 26. And Vernon L. Moore of Boston, Ohio was a gunner. He was 21. And Samuel R. Adams from Eureka, Illinois was a tail gunner. Now, the original crew for the Lady Be Good had Samuel D. Rose as a pilot and Ralph O. Grace as the co-pilot, which I believe Mr. Grace was raised just down the road from Wynn Jones. So some of these names, it's a small world. And the bombardier was Charles Holly Midgley, which I'm fixing to pick him up at the airport next week. Mr. Midgley wound up being in the lead group of the 512th Squadron of the 376. And on a mission over Bari, Italy in July of '43, he was in the lead group when my father was tail end Charlie in the 513th Squadron. My father's plane was terribly shot up and several of his crew were seriously wounded, but Holly's plane went down and he survived and spent the rest of the war as a POW. The Rose crew had their share of tough luck. As a co-pilot in August of '42, Rose's plane had faltered on takeoff and plowed into the San Francisco Bay. Everyone got out, but when Rose got a new crew of his own to train with, he got another old clunker to fly, called Lorelei. Other crews told him that Lorelei wouldn't fly, but they flew several missions without any trouble. Someone suggested that when they finally got assigned their own airplane to take overseas, they should name it Lady Be Good and hope that the name would break the jinx. The last practice flight for Lorelei, she came in and one of the main landing gear struts wouldn't come down, so they landed on the nose wheel and one main wheel and slid sideways down the runway. That was the last of Lorelei. And on February 17th, the Rose crew got a new plane with a new name, and she was Lady Be Good. The crew and the plane arrived in Saluque on March 23rd, 1943. They went up for a familiarization flight and were scheduled for their first combat flight on April 2nd, 1943. But the ground crew couldn't get the plane to check out correctly with electrical and hydraulic problems. So once again, Rose and his crew got an old beat-up 24 to fly on a mission to Palermo. Before the target could be reached, they lost power in two engines. They dropped their bombs and landed on the island of Malta to get repairs. They got back on April 4th, 1943, in time to see the Hatton crew take off in the Lady Be Good. That was the last time they saw the plane or the crew again. Hatton's plane was one of 12 planes in a rear section, Section B, which was taken off to bomb Naples, Italy. And it was a well-planned raid of 25 B-24s. They were to go to Naples at 25,000 feet in broad daylight, hit the target just at sunset. Then they were to break formation and then come home in singles under the cover of darkness for protection, because at that time they didn't have any fighter protection. And coming back by in singles was safer and made it harder to be seen by the Luftwaffe night fighters. The B planes in the rear, all 13 planes in the front A section took off safely. All the planes reached their target, they tore it up, and every plane got shot up. But the dust stirred up on this dirt runway at Saluque played heck on the engines of the rear section, Section B. Before they could reach the target, 8 of the 12 planes of the B section began to turn back and fall out of formation, with engines either losing power or failing completely. And on his first mission, Hatton went from being follow the leader to being the lead plane in a 4-plane formation. Now, none of the planes in the B section made it to target. With Hatton in the lead, 50 miles south of Naples, Hatton in the lead plane turned around and headed back to base. Now, whether this was because it got dark and he felt he couldn't accurately hit the target is not known. There was no radio message or giving any of his reasons. But the 4 planes remained in visual contact till they left Italy's coast, and then they got separated. The flight back remained a challenge as well, with dark, thick clouds and electrical storms below 12,000 feet. All 3 planes, led by the Lady Be Good, arrived back safely. 1 went to Malta, and 2 arrived at the Saluque base, the last one landing at 11:30 p.m. that night. At 12:20 a.m., the radio directional finding station, 30 miles from the Saluque base, received a coded message requesting a positional bearing. The station operator advised the plane that they were on a heading of 330 degrees north-northwest from the station. Now, this would have been correct if they had been incoming towards the base. But since 40 minutes had already passed since the last plane had landed, Hatton and his crew had already passed the coast and were heading at a direction of 150 degrees, already 100 miles past the base, south. So this was the last contact with the plane. Though most of the searches for the Lady Be Good went north of the base over the Mediterranean Ocean, assuming that they had gone down at sea, several people at the base, my father being one, said that they heard a plane pass over the base around 11 o'clock p.m. And one crew from the 514th Hatton Squadron did go up and fly a heading of 150 degrees for 200 miles south of Saluque, but they found nothing. This was because the plane had continued on that course of 150 degrees till the B-24 had completely run out of fuel and was actually 420 miles south of the base at Salute. Now, the crew bailed out of the plane, 3 engines were feathered, and the controls were set on autopilot, where the plane would fly level. Assuming that they were out over the ocean, the crew put on their May West vests and bailed out, when in fact they were 420 miles south of the base in the middle of the desert. Well, searches were made for the plane, and reports were filed, and the crew went from missing in action to missing and presumed dead. Then in November 9th, 1958, a pilot for a British oil company, also a geologist, was doing an aerial survey looking for the right rock formations to drill for oil, and he spotted the Lady Be Good. He circled the wreck, noted that it was an American bomber, made a notation on his map for an approximate location, and returned to Tripoli to file his geological report with the company, and made a notation of the wreck. Now, it was odd that the plane was so far off the beaten path, but it wasn't odd to find a wreck in North Africa. There were hundreds of planes scattered all over from all of the countries involved, and so no further report or looking was done. But in February 1959, another survey crew from the same company returned to the same area on the ground to continue the survey. And in looking at the notation from the previous report, they knew about the plane and they were looking for it, and eventually found the wreck. What they found was a plane that had so little damage that they thought the crew had bellied it in, and it looked as if the crew could have easily survived a crash landing. The survey crew found the plane undisturbed with equipment, flight logs, food, and supplies, all untouched. But in the immediate vicinity, there was not one single sign of the air crew. So the survey crew decided to leave the bomber as they found it, file a report, tell what they had seen. They jotted down the number off the tail of the plane and all the names of the crew members that they found inside from the clothing left behind. And on March 24th, when the crew went back to Tripoli, this information was sent to the officials at Wheelus Air Base in Tripoli. Well, that put the wheels in motion, and Wheelus officials wired their headquarters in Wiesbaden, Germany, asking for instructions. Now what do we do? So Wiesbaden officials were just as puzzled, and they wired the Pentagon, asking for any Army Air Corps records. The Pentagon was contacted, and it talked to retired records center in St. Louis that confirmed through the Maxwell Historical Research Center in Montgomery, Alabama, that this was indeed a plane with the 376 and had been reported lost since April 4th, 1943. Well, this was 1959, and all the movies that I watched back then were about World War II, so there's still plenty of interest. And so when the news that this plane was found with no air crew, and it hit the news wire, well, the next of kin wanted to know what had happened to the crew. So on May 14th, 1959, the Air Force sent out a C-54 to fly over the area and visually look for signs of the crew. Well, nothing was seen. So on May 24th, the C-47 and a crew flew out to inspect the B-24. Now, this plane had come down on a barren, rocky gravel plain. Now, all around it, some 30 miles, was an ocean of sand. But at this place, the ground was firm, and the C-47 could land and taxi right up to the wreck. They came out and they found out that 3 engines were intact on the plane and feathered, and that 1 engine that had been running was the only one that was torn loose from the wing. Otherwise, the plane had landed itself with minimal damage, and at touchdown had been so textbook that there was no scratches seen under either wingtip. An inspection of the plane showed that the radio, the guns, and other equipment all in working order. A blank sheet of the navigation log was found with no entries made for the last 6 hours that the plane had been in the air. A search of the area brought no signs of the crew, and on June 4th, 1959, the Associated Press released a story about the greatest air mystery of modern times. Where is the crew? Well, on June 16th, the Air Force returned with a large search of the area. Clothing and markers made from strips of parachute silk were found to make large 15-foot arrows pointing in the way north, the direction that the crew was walking, trying to return back to base, to give search parties some idea of where to find them. So they found clothing and markers, but they didn't find anything of the crew. They searched for about 2 months, and with no sign of the crew, the thought was that without food and water, the crew would only be able to go about 25 or 30 miles away from the crash site. So in September 9th, 1959, the search was called off, and the thought was that the crew had perished in the sand dunes and their bodies had been covered. As I made mention of the Armstrong Theater, if you watch that, that is the census that is left with the, they put together what they think might have happened, how the plane was mistaken and missed the base, but the impression that they leave you is that the crew is lost. Their bodies are buried somewhere in the desert. That's what they put out on the TV in 1960. But in February of 1960, the oil survey crew, still out there and busy, found the remains of 5 crew members, 85 miles northwest of the Lady Be Good. This revealed a diary of the co-pilot and a brief summary of their 8-day ordeal trying to walk out. And that helped lead to the findings of 2 more crew members' bodies. The last crew member was found August 11th, 1960, 3 months after the searchers from Wheelus had returned back to Tripoli. And that was the body of the, that was also found by the geologist 2 miles north of the plane. This was the body of the bombardier who had parachuted out. His chute failed to open, and so he died on impact. The rest of the crew had assembled just a half-mile north of him. The body of the bombardier had a full canteen of water and other supplies, and it might not have been enough to change the final fate, but it certainly would have been a welcome sight. The site remained basically untouched until April 1968, when a Royal Air Force Desert Rescue Team visited the site and recovered 21 items for study by McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Company. Now this was to understand the effects of long-term storage on ICBM missiles. They took engines, hydraulic cylinders, some personal effects, the vest, rubber items, tires, to look and see what damage they had suffered from being out there in the desert for 20 years. What they found was the engine was full of sand, spark plugs were fouled, and sand was everywhere, even in the oil in the crankcase. But the oil itself was undamaged and undeteriorated. The tests of the tire rubber and the rubber in the hydraulic seals showed that they were completely functional. So from this study, scheduled replacement of the seals on the ICBM missiles was changed. By August 1994, geological survey teams and other picker-uppers had stripped the Lady Be Good down to where there was nothing left but just an airframe. So in August 1984, the airframe was moved to a military barracks at Tobruk, where I believe it rests today. There were several memorials to the Lady Be Good that made across the country. One of the propellers was removed and set up at the headquarters at Wheelus Air Force Base. This and a 17-foot stained glass window in their chapel, within the lower left-hand corner, a picture of a broken B-24 in the stained glass to remember the plane and its crew. Since Wheelus closed in 1971, the propeller and the window are now on display with other items that were studied by McDonnell Douglas at the National Air Force Museum at Dayton, Ohio. Another of the propellers from the Lady Be Good is at Lake Linden at their VFW, which is the hometown of Robert Lamont, the radio operator. Now, if you look at those 2 books in the hospitality room, the history of the 376 has a complete chapter on the Lady Be Good, and then there's a little book entitled Lady Be Good, and they have 2 different takes on the events of the plane and the crew. The smaller book, The Lady Be Good, references several times that the plane was an ill-fated ship and that the bad luck that was visited on its crew was also visited on the other 3 crews that flew with her that evening. So the fate of Bill Hatton and his crew was a matter of bad luck. Now, if you look at the larger history book, the 376 history written by James Walker, well, he portrays the crew as heroes for what they were able to accomplish walking 8 to 120 miles from the crash site. Now, if you come to a 376 reunion, I think you'll find that the feelings are somewhere in between. That the crew made an enormous effort to survive is without question. That it was a tragedy is also a truth. My father, being the first pilot, had his own opinion of what happened that evening. When asked by James Walker about what he thought happened, my father's terse reply was, well, there was a conversation going on between the pilot and the navigator, and they didn't end it till they bailed out and landed in the desert, and then they knew who was right. In the late 90s, Mr. Walker was involved in a program for the History Channel about the Lady Be Good. And if you listen to that program, he stresses how the blame for the tragedy lay on the navigator, that he had not made any entries in his log for 6 hours, and so that was proof that the plane was flying without an effective navigator. Well, my father was the first pilot, but in his training, he also went through basic courses on radio, Morse code, and also navigation. Now, he might have not known every constellation there was in the solar system, but they weren't just points of light. He told me, when I asked the navigator what our position was, if his figures didn't match my figures, then I told him that he needed to refigure his figures. In a training mission in early 1943 from Alamogordo, New Mexico to Omaha, Nebraska, my father was in a flight of 6 planes that hit heavy clouds, and 4 of the planes turned back, and the remaining 2 became separated and lost sight of one another. My father continued on to Omaha. He said, I knew according to time and speed that we should be approaching the base. But then there was a remark heard over the headsets for everybody to hear from the navigator, and he said, are we lost? About that moment, the radio compass picked up the directional signal from the base. He said, now if you turn left and right and you watch the way the needle moves, you can tell whether you're ahead of the signal or behind it. I moved left and right, and it was dead ahead. My father's reply to the navigator was, no, we're not lost. We're going to be landing in about 5 minutes. I found my father's tail gunner's diary that he kept, and in the diary, in early entries, it revealed that the opinion of the crew was that the navigator couldn't find his butt in a bathtub with both hands. But this same navigator was able to take them down to South America, find the Azores, and get them safely to Africa. Now, I don't know what this little incident in Omaha might have embarrassed him a little bit and woke him up to the fact what his duties were and the seriousness of the situation. The pilot is the leader of his crew, and the crew will follow like puppies, but they need to be led by example. I can't say exactly how Hatton led his crew. They had only arrived at the salute base for a few days when Hatton and his co-pilot were offered a trip to Cairo by another first pilot. They eagerly accepted, and they spent 3 days in Cairo and saw the pyramids and the Sphinx and the sights. I have a picture of my father on a camel in front of the Sphinx. He was there, but he took his crew along with him. I don't know what Hatton did, but Dad said when we got to salute, I said, boys, now we can all wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and we can go to breakfast together, and then we can go to the briefings for the mission. He said I ate alone. The waist gunner and the tail gunner were out drinking with the bombardier, and I don't know where the co-pilot was, but I didn't see anybody at the briefings. So after the mission, I said, boys, I don't care if you eat with me or not, but you will go to briefings. Schultz, my flight engineer, was the oldest at 23, so I said, Schultz, you take care of the enlisted men and I'll take care of the officers. The next mission, I went into the bombardier's tent, and he was sitting on his cot reading a Life magazine. I came up to him and I said, Bob, we got 10 minutes, come on, we got to go to briefings. He turned the page and was looking at another picture. I don't remember if I spoke to him or whether I just took a step forward, but he jumped off his cot and we went to the briefings. Halfway through, he leaned towards me and softly asked, are you mad at me? I said, no, Bob, why would you ask? He said, well, I thought for a minute you were going to kick my ass. I said, no, Bob, I wasn't going to do that. But you know, he read me right. That's exactly what I was fixing to do. You picked up a plane and a crew and basically had 90 days to work with both of them and put them into a tool and a team that you could trust with your life. This was not an adventure. This was life and death. I once talked to a test pilot from Wright-Patterson about the Martin B-26 bomber that had a bad reputation and was called a widowmaker. He said it was a good plane, but if you ever stalled her out, you needed about 6,000 feet to recover. If you were below that, you were in trouble and you were going in. The mistakes made by the pilot and the navigator on the Lady Be Good didn't allow them the time and the distance to recover, and they went in. They were a green crew, and they hadn't learned their lessons yet, and they didn't get a second chance. That they were brave and patriotic to volunteer and serve is without question. That they were heroes, well, you can argue that all you want. That it was a tragedy is a fact, but it certainly wasn't the only tragedy of the war, and certainly not the only tragedy for the 376. Thank you.